What's up everybody? The Storm Rising Overwatch event launched a short while ago, and despite it being Archives, which is the most popular event of the year, the Overwatch community had a fairly negative reaction to it once we actually got to see what all it had. Many players felt underwhelmed by the new PvE game mode, and some of the cosmetics weren't exactly what people were wanting. So in this video, I'm going to be analyzing the new event and covering everything that Blizzard did with it to try and figure out what went wrong. This is Master Ian Gamer, and let's get into it. Now, since I want to give it a proper review and consider all the aspects of this brand new event, I want to consider both the good and the bad for it. After all, it wasn't a complete flop, and it does have some redeeming qualities. So to start, let's take a look at what Storm Rising did right. First up, the new cosmetics. Like usual, we got a bunch of new skins and other cosmetic items with this year's Storm Rising event. It included 6 new legendary skins, 3 new epics, 3 new highlight intros, as well as several voice lines and 3 new victory poses. Now, while some people haven't been very satisfied with the cosmetics we got this time around, I will say that when it comes to cosmetic items, and especially new skins, whether or not people end up liking them is very subjective. It doesn't matter which heroes end up getting skins in any given event, there's always going to be people who are disappointed that their favorite heroes didn't get the skins that they had in mind. When it comes to just looking at the objective levels of detail for these skins, they're honestly pretty good. Maybe not anything astounding or super groundbreaking when it comes to what we would expect from event skins, but in terms of their quality, they're right on the mark, and thus I have to give Blizzard credit for adding good new skins. Some people have been confused about the epic skins and that they don't seem to have a relevant theme pertaining to Archives. However, it does seem like they are in fact tied to Monaco, which we do know is the home of Maximilian, so it seems like Blizzard was going for some sort of connected theme there. As for whether or not that was the best route for them to take is really kind of up for debate, but personally I commend Blizzard for trying out a new sort of theming for this year's epic skins. If you still don't quite understand exactly how all these skins tie to Monaco, I recommend you check out one of my previous videos where I outline each of the specific skins and how in fact they're connected. So you can check that video out through the card on screen if you haven't seen it already. Moving on to the next thing that Blizzard did well with Storm Rising, we have these cinematics for the new PvE mode. These cinematics were done very well. They were high action, super exciting, had great dialogue, especially in the cinematic after the PvE mission, and overall I can tell that Blizzard is improving when it comes to their in-game rendered cinematics like this. It's definitely a step up from the cinematic we got in Retribution last year, and personally I really hope that we start to see more of these later down the line. Maybe they don't even need to be tied to specific events or story missions. Maybe Blizzard could just start putting these out as sort of miniature versions of the normal animated shorts we get, since these are obviously much cheaper to produce and thus could be pumped out much more regularly. That would potentially be a great way to help continue to flesh out the story and expand on the existing characters without necessarily needing to put in all the time and money when it comes to the bigger production cinematics. Moving on to the next thing that I think Blizzard did well with this event is the fact that we simply got a new PvE mission. Now, I get that a lot of people have been a bit disappointed with this mission, and I will be talking more about that once I get onto the negatives of the Storm Rising event, but when it really comes down to it, we shouldn't overlook the fact that we did get a new PvE mission, something new for us to play. Even if it isn't quite as exciting as the ones in the past, it's still something new. It's honestly better than getting nothing, so I have to say, good job for Blizzard for adding something new. Was it enough? Probably not, but again, I'll cover that more in just a second. And the last big positive I want to point out for this year's event is that it expands the story, and specifically gives focus to some of people's fan favorite characters, such as Maximilian. We finally get to hear what Maximilian sounds like, we get a bit of animation showing the way he acts, the way he talks, and for those of you who are big fans of this character, this is awesome. If there's one thing that Overwatch as a game does incredibly well when it comes to its story, it's that it's great at establishing lovable characters. And so for Blizzard to make an event where we actually get to see more of a character who's not even a playable hero, that's really awesome. Sure, there are a lot of existing characters which could certainly get a little bit of love when it comes to expanding their backstories and whatnot, but I will give credit where credit is due, and I'm glad to see that Blizzard is fleshing out the story, even if it's only just a little bit, and showing off some of the characters that many of us are a fan of. Anyways, now that I've covered all the great things about Storm Storm Rising, let's move on to the negatives. First up is that the Storm Rising mission has unoriginal gameplay. Not only does this mission have the exact same kind of enemies we fought in the Retribution mission last year, but when it comes to the playable heroes in the story mode, we get 3 of the exact same characters we've played previously, with Winston being the only newcomer. Because of this, this mission feels very, very repetitive, in that it feels like we're basically playing a slight alteration of something we've played in the past. It doesn't offer enough new content in terms of the heroes we play or the enemies we're fighting in order to make it really stand out from the other missions. They're the exact same ones we saw previously, except this time they're in a different map. And I will give them credit, a new map is nice, and I'm definitely excited to seeing that as a PvP map coming very soon, but it just feels like Blizzard rehashed what they already had from previous years in order to give us something that's, well, by comparison, rather underwhelming. The next big con of Storm Rising, though, is that the PvE mission itself was simply too short. There isn't enough that actually happens within the mission itself to feel like you've had the proper sort of build up to any sort of grand finale where once you beat it, you've finished the mission. It's just push through, get held up a bit in the distillery, push through, and then have a brief final stand at the sea fort. There's no big climactic finish, and once it ends and you see the ending cinematic, it really feels like, oh, there's going to be more after this to follow up, but then there just isn't. Overall, the PvE mission itself just feels unexciting, and I'm sure a large part of that is because of the reused enemies and reused playable heroes, but even with that rehashed content, I feel like Blizzard really could have done a bit more to make the mission itself stand out more and be a bit more interesting and impactful when it comes to playing through it, because what we did end up getting was just really kind of dull. The next major bad thing about Storm Rising is that the story which accompanies it is very weak, and a large factor behind this is the fact that the mission didn't have any sort of complementary comic released alongside it. Both Uprising and Retribution each had their own comic outlining the details leading up to the PvE mission itself, and while we did get an explanation as for why we're in Havana and why we're hunting down Maximilian, it really would have benefited the mission overall and the event as a whole if there was some kind of comic to further get people hyped and invested in the story surrounding the event. For those of you who are a bit more invested into the actual Overwatch timeline and everything, you can tell that this specific mission is most likely very critical when it comes to the end days of Overwatch and how it ultimately ends up falling. But for the average player, that wouldn't be evident because there's no comic to really inform the people who don't keep up quite so closely with the story itself, and the mission that we actually play in game just doesn't highlight enough of what's really going on in order for it to feel very impactful. It doesn't carry the same weight of trying to save London from Null Sector or escape Rialto after having murdered the head of Talon. It just feels like, oh, this is just another mission where we're chasing some Omnic fellow that some of us recognize, but a lot of people probably don't even. So in that regard, the story overall for this mission just kind of fell flat. I do believe that Blizzard has an idea for what's going on and why it's important here, but they just did a terrible job of conveying it to the players when you're experiencing the event itself. So now that I've covered both the good and the bad of this year's Storm Rising event, what is my final verdict? Well, if nothing else, I think the event is decent as just another event. We get more cosmetics, we get to play a new game mode. In that regard, sure, it's a fine event and one that I'm happy happened, but overall, it just wasn't grand enough, it wasn't impactful enough to really carry the weight that we were expecting and hoping to get in an Archives event. Especially compared to Retribution last year, when you see just how much hype there was leading up to it, all the teasers and all the build-up initiated by Blizzard themselves, leading into this immensely impactful mission with high stakes and a great story surrounding it, Storm Rising just feels like some sort of random mission, like a filler episode on a Saturday morning cartoon. As I said, we can tell that there is probably quite a bit of story revolving around this mission, but Blizzard just doesn't do a good enough job of conveying it to the average player in order for it to really really mean anything. So needless to say, I think most, if not all of us, would agree that out of the 3 Archives events we've had over the years since the launch of Overwatch, Storm Rising probably is the weakest. Now, I don't think it's objectively bad to rehash the content in this way. I think if we got a new PvE mission like this a few times every year, like maybe 3 or 4 times instead of just once, and we could sort of build up the sort of backlog of all these different missions you can go on in the same style as a game like Left 4 Dead, then that could actually be pretty cool. But the way Blizzard handles it, with only having these modes available 3 weeks out of the year, it's just not really a good way to go about doing it. Now, I will also point out that this event in some ways to me did feel a bit rushed. The fact that the enemies were just rehashed from Retribution and the overall scope of the mission itself just felt really short and just too quickly finished makes me wonder if they just didn't have enough time to really dedicate to it. In an interview he did with fellow YouTubers and content creators on the day that the event launched, Jeff Kaplan said that they finished the Havana map and Storm Rising mission over the time period of about 6 months. Previously, we knew that Retribution took an entire year to finish, so it definitely sounds like they didn't spend as much time on it, but the other question that does raise then is why? As I'm sure many of you recall, Activision, the company which owns Blizzard, did have a pretty rough end of 2018. There were a lot of controversial issues coming up, and they ended up firing huge swaths of their employees, and overall the company has really just been in a rather messy state for the last several months. It sounds like they're kind of starting to recover at this point, but I would not be surprised if the Storm Rising mission we got this year, and the general lackluster feel of it, was the result of some of the internal business issues that they were running into recently. That's not to defend Blizzard and say that they have a pass for giving us a fairly lackluster event, but if we're looking for what exactly went wrong and why we ended up getting the mission we did, it's probably not because the Overwatch devs just didn't care or didn't want to give us a fun, exciting new adventure to go on, but rather just real-life limitations that forced them into a position where they couldn't give us enough great new content to really wow us once again. And as I said, compared to Retribution from 2018, they had some very high expectations to live up to. Overall, I do really hope that Blizzard can get their stuff back together and start giving us better content moving forwards. Archives is supposed to be one of the few times of the year where we can get really excited for big new content coming out, and unfortunately this time that really wasn't the case. Again, I'm glad we got the content we did, and I super appreciate the time and effort that Blizzard did put into making that, but if they want their game to keep lasting for years and years to come, they're really gonna have to step it up. If they can't start fixing things soon, then they won't have much of an audience left to appreciate things once they do finally get around to improving it. Anyways, these have been my thoughts about the 2019 Archives event Storm Rising. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Do you agree that the event this year was fairly lackluster, or were you quite happy with what we ended up getting? Either way, be sure to leave a like if you enjoyed this video and share it with a friend if you really liked it. Subscribe, follow me on Twitter, and hit up the bell to never miss any of my future Overwatch content. This is Master Ian Gamer signing off, and until next time, have a great day.